I didn't find out the HOA was using my land because they warned me, fined me, or challenged me. I found out because they were too comfortable to hide it. That comfort, that assumption that no one ever checks, is what destroyed their control in the end. And the moment I realized what was really happening beneath their perfectly maintained sidewalks and cheerful welcome signs, I knew the story wouldn't end the way they expected. The land had been in my family longer than the subdivision existed. 20 acres of open ground, uneven in places, quiet in others, sitting just beyond a gated community run by a confident, rule-heavy HOA. I rarely visited the far edge of it, because nothing ever happened there. Or so I thought. One afternoon, while walking the boundary after a storm, I noticed something that didn't belong. A drainage channel. Clean. Reinforced. Maintained. Leading straight from the HOA's property onto mine. At first, I assumed it was temporary. Maybe erosion control. Maybe a shared easement I'd forgotten about. But the further I walked, the stranger it became. Paved access paths. Utility markings. Even a small landscaped strip designed to look intentional, permanent, and unquestionably official. This wasn't an accident. This was infrastructure. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't take pictures dramatically or call a lawyer in a rush of anger. Instead, I did something far more dangerous to them. I went quiet. I went home, pulled old files, and started checking records. Deeds. Surveys. County maps. I expected confusion. What I found was clarity. There was no easement. No sale. No agreement. Not past, not pending, not forgotten. The HOA had simply expanded, slowly and confidently, onto land they did not own. And they had done it long enough that no one questioned it anymore. Not residents. Not contractors. Not even the board members approving maintenance budgets. That was the moment everything shifted for me. Not emotionally, but strategically. I realized they weren't powerful. They were exposed. Their authority rested on habit, not legality. And habits collapse the second someone interrupts them with proof. I didn't need to fight them. I didn't need to warn them. I only needed to make one move, at the right time, in the right way. A move so quiet they wouldn't see it coming until their control was already gone. That's when I stopped reacting and started planning. Once I understood what I was dealing with, I treated the situation like a puzzle instead of a problem. Problems demand reactions. Puzzles reward patience. The HOA had unknowingly given me an advantage by assuming I would behave like everyone else, loud, emotional, and rushed. I decided not to be predictable. For weeks, I changed nothing. I didn't block access. I didn't post signs. I didn't confront workers who crossed onto my land. Instead, I observed. I watched how often HOA crews entered the area, how confidently they operated, and how deeply their systems depended on that space. Water runoff, maintenance vehicles, even emergency access routes all cut through my property. This wasn't cosmetic use. It was operational dependence. I also noticed something more important. None of it was documented publicly. Their newsletters praised community improvements without mentioning locations. Budget reports lumped maintenance costs together vaguely. It was designed to look seamless, unquestioned. That told me they didn't want attention on specifics. I began building a quiet record of my own. Not surveillance, not confrontation, just facts. Dates when crews entered. Types of work done. The scope of improvements. I compared those notes with public HOA filings and found gaps. Money was being spent on land they had no legal claim to, and no one was asking why. Then I visited the county offices. Not with accusations, but with curiosity. I asked how easements were recorded. How disputes were typically handled. What happened if infrastructure was built without authorization? The answers were calm, routine, and devastating for the HOA. Liability fell on the builder. Usage without permission didn't create ownership. Time didn't legitimize trespass. That's when I realized my silence wasn't passive. It was strategic. Every day the HOA continued using my land without permission strengthened my position, not theirs. Every dollar they spent increased their exposure. Every assumption they made hardened the reality that they were operating on borrowed ground. The temptation to confront them grew, but I resisted it. Confrontation would alert them. Silence kept them comfortable. And comfort makes people careless. I also thought carefully about how I wanted this to end. I didn't want chaos. I didn't want neighbors caught in the middle. I wanted control corrected, not replaced with hostility. That meant my move had to be precise, undeniable, and impossible to spin. So I prepared one document. Clear language. Neutral tone. No threats. No emotion. Just ownership, boundaries, and one simple statement of fact that would force them to stop assuming and start responding. I didn't send it yet. Timing was everything. The moment I chose wasn't dramatic. That was the point. I waited until the HOA was busiest reassuring residents that everything was stable. Annual planning season. Budget approvals. Contractor renewals. When organizations feel secure, they stop double-checking their footing, and that's when reality hits hardest. I sent a single certified letter. No accusations. No legal threats. No emotional language. It opened by identifying me as the owner of the parcel in question, referenced exact boundary coordinates, and attached copies of the recorded deed and survey. Then came one short paragraph that changed everything. I stated that I had recently become aware of HOA infrastructure and maintenance activity occurring within my property boundaries and requested written clarification of the legal authority permitting that use. That was it. No deadline. No demands. Just a request for clarification. The silence that followed was immediate and telling. Maintenance crews stopped entering the area. Contractors were redirected without explanation. A scheduled drainage upgrade was quietly postponed. The HOA's confidence evaporated overnight, replaced by hesitation. When systems pause suddenly, it means someone realized they might be standing on very thin ground. 3 days later, I received an email from the HOA's management company. Polite. Careful. Vague. They thanked me for bringing the matter to their attention and said they were reviewing internal records. That phrase told me everything. There were no records. Only assumptions. Over the next week, communication shifted from casual to cautious. Emails included attorneys. Language softened. Questions multiplied. Could we meet? Could we discuss options? Would I consider an easement? I responded briefly, always in writing, always neutral. I confirmed ownership. I acknowledged receipt. I asked them to provide documentation supporting their use. They couldn't. Behind the scenes, pressure built. Board members realized the implications. Liability. Insurance exposure. Resident backlash if services were disrupted. Years of unpermitted use suddenly became a serious problem, not because I made it one, but because it already was. That's when the balance of control flipped completely. They weren't deciding how to proceed anymore. They were waiting to see how I would. I didn't rush. I let the uncertainty sit. Uncertainty is powerful when the facts are settled but the outcome isn't. Every day without resolution forced them to confront how dependent they were on land they didn't own. When I finally responded with proposed terms, they didn't argue. They didn't threaten. They asked for revisions. Carefully. Respectfully. The HOA that once operated with unquestioned authority was now negotiating quietly, aware that their control had vanished the moment their assumption met proof. And all of it started with one silent move. Once negotiations began, the HOA's internal structure started bending under pressure. What looked unified from the outside was fragile underneath. Different board members wanted different outcomes. Some wanted to minimize cost. Others wanted the issue to disappear quietly. A few wanted to push back, but none of them could explain how, because facts don't argue back. I kept my position simple. I wasn't interested in revisiting the past or assigning blame. I focused entirely on the present and future. The land was mine. Their infrastructure depended on it. Any continued use required formal permission, clearly defined terms, and accountability. Nothing more. Nothing less. They proposed an easement first. Permanent. Broad. Quietly worded to look harmless. I declined without commentary. Then came temporary access agreements, revised again and again, each version shrinking as their leverage disappeared. With every draft, the truth became clearer. They needed me more than I needed them. While lawyers exchanged language, something else happened that they hadn't anticipated. Word began spreading among residents. Not rumors, but observations. Why was the walking path blocked? Why were trucks no longer maintaining certain areas? Why did the HOA seem cautious all of a sudden? Authority erodes fastest when people notice hesitation. I didn't feed the conversation. I didn't correct assumptions. I stayed invisible. The HOA, however, was forced to explain disruptions without revealing the full reason. That created frustration, and frustration demands answers. The board felt it. Then I made my second quiet move. I marked the property boundary. No fences. No warnings. Just legally compliant markers placed where the survey showed the line. Subtle, undeniable, and perfectly lawful. Overnight, perception shifted. What once looked like common space now had a clear edge. People slowed down. Looked twice. Questioned what they thought they knew. That boundary did more than any letter ever could. It turned assumption into uncertainty. And uncertainty into caution. Within days, the HOA agreed to my original terms almost entirely. Compensation. Defined access. Liability acknowledgement. Maintenance responsibility clearly assigned. No permanent rights. No vague language. Everything documented. They didn't fight it anymore because fighting would expose how far they'd overstepped. Quiet resolution was their only option. When the agreement was finalized, there was no announcement. No apology. Just a new normal. Their control hadn't been taken from them. It had been limited, correctly, by reality. That's when I understood something important. Power doesn't disappear when challenged. It realigns. And when it does, it reveals who was standing on solid ground all along. After the agreement was signed, something subtle but permanent changed in the air. The HOA still existed, still held meetings, still enforced rules inside its neighborhood, but the certainty it once projected was gone. Authority that had never been questioned now moved carefully, like it knew the ground beneath it could shift again if assumptions replaced verification. Payments began arriving on schedule. Always correct. Always on time. That alone spoke volumes. This wasn't cooperation born from goodwill. It was compliance shaped by reality. The HOA understood now that access to my land was not a right, but a privilege renewed by agreement. What surprised me most was how quickly behavior adjusted. Maintenance crews followed access rules precisely. Contractors checked in before entering. Even emergency planning documents were revised to reflect accurate boundaries. The system had corrected itself, not loudly, but thoroughly. Residents noticed too. Conversations changed. People asked questions they'd never asked before. Who owns what? Where does HOA authority actually end? Those questions didn't create chaos. They created awareness. And awareness is dangerous to any system that relies on blind trust. Board members rotated out during elections. New ones came in more cautious, more careful with language. They referenced documents now instead of tradition. According to the records replaced, this is how it's always been. That shift alone told me the lesson had sunk in. I remained deliberately distant. No celebrations. No public explanations. I didn't want attention, because attention invites emotion, and emotion invites conflict. Stability doesn't need an audience. It needs consistency. One afternoon, a resident approached me quietly while I was walking near the boundary. They apologized for using the land without knowing. Not because they were afraid, but because the situation had reframed how they viewed ownership. That moment mattered more than any payment. It meant the correction had reached the human level, not just the legal one. The HOA attempted to rebrand the agreement internally as a strategic arrangement. That was fine. Labels don't change substance. What mattered was that they no longer acted as if everything beyond their gates automatically belonged to them. From my perspective, the land felt different too. Not physically, but symbolically. It reminded me that what you don't actively understand can quietly be taken for granted by others. Not always maliciously. Often simply because no one stops them. The quiet move didn't just destroy their control. It exposed how fragile that control had always been. Built on assumption. Maintained by routine. Protected by no one checking. Standing there months later, watching normal life resume, I realized the real outcome wasn't dominance. It was correction. The system hadn't been punished. It had been realigned. And that kind of outcome lasts longer than any loud victory ever could. As months passed, the situation stopped feeling like a dispute and started feeling like a lesson unfolding in real time. The agreement held steady, but its ripple effects kept expanding in quiet, unexpected ways. This was no longer just about land use. It was about how authority behaves after it's been corrected. The HOA became noticeably more careful in every decision. New projects were delayed until surveys were double-checked. Legal reviews happened before construction instead of after. Contractors were instructed to confirm boundaries personally. Mistakes that once would have been brushed aside were now treated as serious risks. The association had learned, the hard way, that confidence without verification was dangerous. What stood out most was how fear wasn't the motivator. Awareness was. They weren't afraid of me specifically. They were aware of reality in a way they hadn't been before. That awareness reshaped everything. I also noticed a change in myself. I stopped feeling defensive. There was no longer anything to protect or prove. Once ownership was established cleanly, tension disappeared. That's the strange thing about clear boundaries. They don't create conflict. They prevent it. Occasionally, HOA representatives ask small clarifying questions. Could a temporary vehicle pass through? Could maintenance occur outside scheduled times due to weather? Each request came respectfully, documented, and specific. The contrast to their earlier assumptions was stark. This was what cooperation looked like when power was grounded in facts. Neighbors adjusted naturally. People found new walking routes. Community events shifted locations. What once felt like inconvenience slowly became routine. Humans adapt quickly when rules are clear and consistent. I realized then that most conflicts don't escalate because of malice. They escalate because of vagueness. When lines are blurry, people push. When lines are clear, people stop. One evening, while reviewing the original documents again, I thought about how easily this could have gone differently. If I had reacted emotionally. If I had confronted the board publicly. If I had tried to shame them. Any of those paths would have turned this into a prolonged fight. Instead, patience turned it into a correction. The HOA's control hadn't just been destroyed. It had been resized. shrunk to match what it was actually entitled to. And that resizing benefited everyone, even if they didn't realize it. The land itself didn't change. The trees didn't move. The ground didn't shift. Only perception did. And perception, once adjusted, rarely returns to its previous state. That's when I understood the deeper truth. Real power doesn't need to dominate. It only needs to be accurate. Accuracy outlasts aggression every time. And this story wasn't finished yet, because the final impact wasn't about the HOA at all. It was about what this experience revealed about systems, people, and the quiet strength of knowing exactly where you stand. What lingered after everything settled was not tension, but awareness. I noticed it first in the HOA's behavior, then in the residents, and finally in myself. Everyone moved more deliberately, as if an invisible line now existed where assumptions used to live. That line didn't feel restrictive. It felt clarifying. The HOA's meetings became quieter. Less posturing. More referencing documents. Decisions that once passed on confidence alone now required confirmation. Surveys were reviewed. Records were checked. Lawyers were consulted early, not as a threat, but as a safeguard. Authority had slowed down, and in doing so, it had become more stable. Residents changed in smaller ways. They asked before using space. They questioned notices that felt vague. They paid attention to boundaries they'd never noticed before. Ownership, once invisible, had become part of daily awareness. That shift didn't create conflict. It created respect. I found my own habits changing too. I stopped rushing to respond when something felt off. I verified before reacting. I read more closely. I trusted documentation over confidence. The situation had quietly retrained my instincts, and I realized how often power operates simply because no one pauses to look. One afternoon, a former board member reached out privately. Not to argue. Not to justify. Just to say they wished someone had questioned things earlier. Their words confirmed what I already knew. The issue wasn't malice. It was momentum. Systems roll forward until something interrupts them. What struck me most was how ordinary life continued. No dramatic fallout. No public reckoning. Just a corrected reality settling into place. That's how you know something was handled properly. When it doesn't need to be explained anymore. The land itself became symbolic. Not of conflict, but of clarity. A reminder that what you own deserves attention, and what you oversee deserves verification. Neglect creates opportunity. Attention restores balance. I began noticing similar patterns elsewhere. At work. In organizations. In everyday interactions. Rules assumed rather than checked. Authority accepted rather than confirmed. The lesson applied far beyond property lines. It reminded me that silence is not absence, but control. When you choose not to react, you force others to reveal themselves. Systems expose weaknesses when they expect noise and meet patience instead. That patience is uncomfortable for those relying on momentum. It slows them down, makes them question, and eventually makes them adjust without ever feeling attacked. Quiet certainty reshapes power faster than outrage ever could when facts remain undeniable and visible. Power hadn't vanished. It had matured. And that maturity was the true outcome of one silent move. By this point, the situation had fully transitioned from conflict to consequence. Not punishment, not embarrassment, consequence. The kind that lingers quietly and reshapes behavior long after the original issue is resolved. That was when I realized the HOA wasn't the only thing that had lost control. Old assumptions had too. The association now operated with visible caution. Every notice was reviewed. Every boundary was checked. Every contractor agreement included precise language. What once relied on confidence now relied on confirmation. It wasn't fear-driven. It was experience-driven. They had learned what happens when authority moves faster than truth. Residents adjusted in ways that felt almost invisible. There was less entitlement, more awareness. People stopped assuming access meant permission. They noticed signs, maps, and property markers. Conversations shifted from "we've always done this" to "do we actually have the right?" That single change in mindset altered the tone of the entire community. I stayed deliberately out of view. No interviews. No explanations. No social posts. Silence protected the outcome. When people don't feel challenged publicly, they don't feel the need to defend themselves. That allowed the correction to settle naturally instead of becoming a point of pride or resentment. The land itself became a reference point. Not a battleground, but a reminder. Whenever someone asked why a rule existed or why a path changed, the answer wasn't emotional. It was factual. Ownership. Boundaries. Records. Facts ended debates before they began. I revisited the original discovery often, not out of worry, but reflection. How easily this could have gone unnoticed forever. How many systems quietly expand beyond their limits simply because no one checks. It wasn't malicious. It was habitual. And habits thrive in silence until someone introduces awareness. That awareness didn't just stop misuse. It improved governance. The HOA became more transparent. Residents became more informed. Decisions slowed down, but they also became more defensible. Stability replaced speed. What surprised me most was how calm everything felt afterward. No lingering hostility. No quiet resentment. Just adjustment. When truth is introduced without aggression, people adapt instead of resisting. That adaptation lasts. The power game hadn't ended with a winner and a loser. It ended with alignment. Authority matched reality. Control matched ownership. And once those lines were drawn correctly, there was nothing left to contest. Only one part of the story remained. Not what happened to them, but what this experience permanently changed about how I see power, silence, and the value of knowing exactly where you stand. The last change wasn't visible on maps or documents. It happened quietly, inside me, long after the HOA had adjusted and the land issue faded into routine. That's when I understood the real weight of what had happened. This was never just about 20 acres. It was about how power actually works when no one is watching. Before this, I believed standing up for yourself meant being loud, fast, and firm. Speak first. Push back hard. Don't let anyone get comfortable. But this experience dismantled that belief completely. I saw how noise often feeds the very systems it tries to fight. Silence, when paired with truth, does the opposite. It drains them. The HOA lost control the moment they realized I wasn't reacting emotionally. They couldn't frame me as hostile. They couldn't rush me into mistakes. They couldn't rely on intimidation or delay tactics. All they had left was reality, and reality doesn't negotiate on feelings. What stayed with me was how little force it took once preparation was done. The hardest part wasn't sending the letter or marking the boundary. The hardest part was waiting. Waiting without showing my hand. Waiting without needing validation. Waiting while others continued confidently on ground that wasn't theirs. I began applying that lesson everywhere. In conversations. In decisions. In moments where I once felt pressured to respond immediately. I learned to pause, verify, and act only when I understood the full picture. That alone changed outcomes more than any argument ever had. The HOA didn't become my enemy. They became an example. An example of how systems drift when unchecked, and how quickly they correct themselves when someone introduces facts without ego. There was no humiliation. No public collapse. Just a quiet return to proper boundaries. Sometimes I walk the edge of that land and watch ordinary life continue. Kids playing. Neighbors chatting. Maintenance crews working exactly where they're supposed to. Nothing dramatic. And that's the point. The best resolutions don't leave scars. They leave stability. If there's one thing this story proves, it's that power doesn't belong to the loudest voice or the largest group. It belongs to whoever knows the truth and has the patience to let it work. Ownership isn't just about land. It's about clarity. And clarity, once asserted calmly, changes everything around it. I didn't destroy their control with force. I removed it by refusing to play their game. One silent move. One fact. One moment of patience. And the entire balance shifted, permanently. That's how quiet decisions outlast loud ones. And that's why the most powerful move I made was choosing not to rush at all.